Hey students, welcome to Unit 8.3, Operant Conditioning. Alright ladies and gents, the precursor to operant conditioning was actually the law of effect as developed by this man, E.L. Thorndike. Okay? Well, how he came up with the law of effect is he studied rats in mazes, and he found that rats were able to complete the maze if they had some type of incentive at the end, like cheese. And so he developed the law of effect, which is the principle that behaviors followed by favorable consequences become more likely, and that behaviors followed by unfavorable consequences become less likely. Notice there's nothing in here about punishments or rewards. That's the main difference between law of effect and operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is essentially kind of like the law of effect. It builds off of the law of effect. It has more working parts, more concepts that interrelate with it. It focuses more on reinforcement and punishment in terms of altering behavior. So in that aspect, operant conditioning is different than the law of effect. Okay, so operant conditioning, as we've discussed at the beginning of the year, was developed by this man here. His name is B.F. Skinner, and he developed this by using pigeons. And we're going to talk about the Skinner box in class. Don't let me forget. All right. So really, what is operant conditioning? Operant conditioning is a type of learning where behavior is strengthened if followed by a reinforcer or diminished if followed by a punisher. Notice the reinforcer and punisher are the two components missing from the law of effect. All right. So there are two types of behavior according to the operant conditioning learning theory. There is respondent behavior, which is essentially classical conditioning, if you think about it. It's behavior that occurs as an automatic response to a particular stimuli. Respondent behavior is operant's explanation for classical conditioning. That's important to note. All right. So then what is operant behavior? If respondent behavior is just responding to stimuli, like you guys packing your stuff up to leave when you hear the sound of a bell at the end of class, then what's operant behavior? Operant behavior is behavior that operates on the environment, producing consequences. So for example, you touching the hot stove as a child and burning your hand, that consequence will lead you to the understanding or the newly learned knowledge that, hey, that's hot, I probably shouldn't touch that. So those are the main differences between respondent behavior and operant behavior. Again, respondent behavior is essentially classical conditioning, whereas operant behavior is essentially operant conditioning. But both are explanations through the operant lens. Pictured here is the operant chamber, also known as the Skinner box. This is what we discussed about in the previous slide and also earlier in the year. All right, so pause the video, take a look at that, but we are going to watch a video on this in class. So what you really need to know is that the operant chamber utilizes the technique called shaping. Shaping is an operant procedure in which reinforcers guide behavior toward closer and closer approximations of a desired behavior. In other words, we want the pigeon to peck at this button, right? And so the pigeon doesn't even know to get near the button. So we reward the pigeon for getting near the button, and then we reward the pigeon for pecking around the button. Then we reward the pigeon for pecking the button itself. It's that sequential, step-by-step reward procedure. That is shaping. So there are two types of reinforcement and two primary types of punishment when it comes to operant conditioning. Now, if you think of it in this way, in terms of math, it's going to be a lot easier for you to memorize. So think about this. You see positive here and positive here. All right, so when you think of positive in terms of math, what is happening to you? We are adding to your state, your current state of being. Okay? So in positive reinforcement, we are adding something to your current state that you enjoy. So if you correctly answer something in class, you get a good grade. If you contribute to class discussion, I'll give you a candy. Okay? That's positive reinforcement. I'm giving you something you desire, which would lead to continued behavior. Whereas positive punishment is where I give you something you don't desire, which would diminish your behavior. So for example, if you talk back to your parents and your mom slaps you in the face, Or if you cuss in front of your parents and they put soap in your mouth, then they are giving you something you do not want, which will diminish that behavior. So it would prevent you from cussing or deter you from cussing anyway. So that would be positive punishment. Okay, whoops. All right, there we go. That would be positive punishment. All right, so negative. All right, it's the same thing. Think about math. Negative reinforcement and negative punishment. We are taking something away from you because it's negative. We are subtracting from your current state of being. All right, so a negative reinforcement, think about it. If it's a reinforcement, do you want me taking away something you want? No, because that would leave you upset. So a negative reinforcement is when I take away something you don't want. So for example, you guys did so well in class discussion today that I'm canceling tomorrow's quiz. How awesome is that? I'm taking away something you probably didn't want to do because you've proved to me that you're studying, you're working hard, you're learning the material, and that's the behavior I want to see from you. Okay, so I'm seeing that change in behavior, which is evident in our class discussion. So I take away something you don't want, i.e. the quiz. All right, and then there's negative punishment. Okay, let's talk about negative punishment now. Negative punishment is when I take away something that you do want. Okay, so let's say I see you guys you're playing a game in class, all right, on your iPad while I'm leading a lecture, and I'm like, hey, what are you doing? You should be paying attention. And you're like, well, I'm just playing a game. And so I take your iPad away. That's something you want. Okay, so that's a negative punishment. I'm taking it away, leaving you like, oh, I want my iPad. And so hopefully you'll pay attention in class more often. Hopefully that will correct that behavior. All right, so if you have any questions over these four, go ahead and watch the video again or watch this segment or ask about it in class and we'll discuss it in class. All right, these next four concepts are the different types of reinforcement. We're going to be really focusing on reinforcement for the rest of this subunit. All right, so because these concepts related to reinforcement are fairly straightforward, I'm just going to kind of rush through them quickly. All right, so primary reinforcer, or a primary reinforcer, is it's a reinforcer that satisfies a biological need. Okay, so what are some biological needs like food, water? Okay, that is a primary reinforcer. So that's why I give you guys candy in class when you add really good class discussion topics. Is because I'm giving you that primary reinforcer because that's something I know you guys will love because it's something you can eat. All right. A conditioned or secondary reinforcer is it's a reinforcer that you associate with a primary reinforcer. It's a secondary reinforcer can provide you a primary reinforcer. So you know, like the brains that I gave you at the beginning of the year that you can redeem for pieces of cake and pie at a Christmas party, that would be a secondary reinforcer. Or like money. If I give you guys $5 for 100 on every test, that would be also a secondary condition reinforcer because you can then use that money to go buy food. All right. Continuous reinforcement is when I reinforce your behavior every time. So every time you participate in class discussion, I give you candy. Every single time. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. So for every one response, you get a reward every time. That's different than partial reinforcement, which is only part of the time, okay? So I reinforce the response only part of the time. So I might reinforce you every 3 times or every 4 times you contribute to class discussion. Or maybe every 2 times, okay? Now, this results in slower acquisition of the desired behavior. Remember acquisition from our last unit? But it leads to greater resistance to extinction of that desired behavior. That's really important for partial reinforcement, and we'll discuss that more in detail in class. Don't let me forget. All right, guys, we're almost done. And we still have more reinforcement to go through. Now, there are 4 different types of partial reinforcement. These are called schedules of reinforcement. Okay? Now, these are all, they're not going to be 1-to-1. Okay? 1-to-1 is continuous reinforcement. So if every time you speak in class, I give you a piece of candy, 1-to-1, one response to one reward, that is continuous. Okay? So a fixed ratio schedule is a reinforcement schedule that reinforces a response only after a specific number of responses. So for example, Every time, if I say, Connor, you're speaking up way too much in class, I will only reward Connor every 5 times he speaks in class. So Connor's like, oh man, that gives me more incentive to speak. So he's going to just keep on speaking, okay, which is great. I love that. So he's going to speak 5 times. I give him a piece of candy only after the 5th time every time. That's fixed ratio. Think about it in this way. It's fixed, meaning it's unchanging, and it's a ratio. In this case, it's 5 to 1. 5 responses to 1 reward, or a reinforcer. All right, then we have variable ratio. It's kind of the same thing, only it's not fixed. Okay, there's still a ratio, but the ratio changes quite frequently. So I could reward Connor after his 5th response, and then I could reward him after his 3rd response. Maybe his 3rd response was really, really good. Or maybe the next time I reward him just after the 1st response. And then the next time I reward him after the 7th response, just because he's kind of starting to bug everybody with all his gratuitous comments. All right, so that would be a variable ratio schedule. Okay. Next is the fixed interval schedule. Fixed interval has to do with time. When you see interval, it has to do with time. When you see ratio, it has to do with ratio. Okay, so fixed interval schedule reinforces a response only after a specified time has elapsed. Okay, so for example, our final Jeopardy answer, I will tell you guys what the answer is only after a certain amount of time has gone by. And that reinforces you guys playing the game in a very excited and active way. That is fixed interval schedule. Or I'll say, hey, if you guys get an A average on every test, then the following Friday I will I'll bring donuts to class. So I'll give you donuts every Friday that you do well on a test. That would be fixed interval schedule. All right, variable interval schedule, again, it's the same thing, only it's variable, meaning it's not fixed. The interval is not fixed. So I could reward you on Monday, Wednesday, and then not reward you again for another month. Okay, it's that kind of schedule. The last 2 concepts we will discuss are how cognition, mental processing, relates to operant conditioning. So the first is the cognitive map. The cognitive map is the environment that you picture in your head. So if you close your eyes and think about your room or think about your house and all the rooms and the hallways and you map it out, that's your cognitive map. So if you give directions by giving landmarks, like take a right at the McDonald's and then keep going straight until you get to CVS and take a left, then you're probably going to have a better cognitive map of your community, as opposed to me, which I give street names. So I don't really know the landmarks as well as I know street names. Okay, so that's the cognitive map. Latent learning is learning that occurs but is not observable in behavior until there is incentive to demonstrate it. So for example, look at your classmates in class. Just by their behavior, just by them sitting there, can you tell that they know the concept of social learning theory? No, you can't tell that just by them sitting there. But if you have them take a survey or have them take a quiz to demonstrate that knowledge, then you'll be able to observe that learning, that understanding. That's latent learning.